helping people cope with and overcome life's challenges. This is Life Transformations with Michael Hart, certified Christian counselor and director of Ottawa's Elim Counseling Services.
Hi, this is Michael Hart of Elim Counseling Services, and I want to thank you for listening to this edition of the Life Transformation Radio Show. This is literally a show where chains are broken and the lives are transformed. As usual, we have an interesting show lined up for you. Today's show is entitled Intergenerational Trauma, and we'll be talking with Viola Thomas, who works with Reconciliation Canada, about her experience in the residential school and what has been done to facilitate emotional healing among people who have suffered in the residential school system. If you're not familiar with Elim Counseling Services, you can find out more about us at elimcounselingministry.com or call us at 613-699-1677. Before we go into today's show, I'd also like to remind you about our free conference that's coming up on the 26th of September. And in this conference, we'll be discussing anxiety and depression and how to deal with anxiety and depression. The best part about this is that this is a community conference and it's free, so everyone can attend. However, we have limited seating, so give us a call at 613-699-1677 to reserve your attendance. And this conference is not only for people who are suffering from mental health, but for people who want to help others and people who want to become more equipped at helping maybe teenagers or helping their own children. And today the topic that we are going to be talking about is something that we see a lot in our practice. We see where people of the influence of one generation affects the other. So we are talking about intergenerational effects of trauma, and our guest today is Viola Thomas. If you're not familiar with Viola works with Reconciliation Canada. Viola originates, I'll let her tell you a little bit more about where she originates from because I'm having difficulty pronouncing some of the words. So Viola, welcome to the Life Transformation Radio Show.
Thank you, Michael. First of all, I want to acknowledge the Algonquin Nation. I'm calling in from unceded territory, and our elders always remind us to acknowledge the territory that we're in. Mm-hmm. I'm originally from the Secwepemc Nation, which is east of Vancouver in British Columbia. We're one of 27 distinct tribal nations in British Columbia. And I attended the same residential school as my mother, the late Mary Louise Thomas, and at the time that she went, it was known as the Kamloops Industrial School, mm-hmm. and I attended along with her, with my other 7 siblings. We all went to the same school, which was operated by the Catholic Church.
All right, before we get into your experience, Viola, and maybe a little bit more about your mother's experience as well, can you talk a little bit about the work, the involvement that you have with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission at present?
I had the opportunity to work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the past 7 years. In fact, I was one of the first employees that was hired and one of the longest-serving employees over the 7-year period of the Truth Commission. And it really came about as a result of a number of class action suits that were brought forward through the courage of survivors in different parts of the country, from the East Coast as well as from the West Coast, from British Columbia. By 2001, there were 8,500 litigations occurring across the country, litigating against the church as well as the government. And the church and the government realized, that they needed to sit down and have a conversation to see which ways they could mitigate all of these these legal litigations that were going on. And so they negotiated what's referred to as the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was born out of that settlement agreement. And so they had a legal mandate to carry out truth telling across the country by hosting 7 national events, as well as establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Center that would house the truth that survivors have shared from across the country.
You talk about survivors. So I'm getting the impression here that a lot of survivors were coming out and talking about how they were disadvantaged, the trauma that they suffered in these residential schools. And this give birth to the lawsuits that happened. And then from there, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was launched. So I wanted to, in the interest of time, to ask you to talk a little bit about your personal experience, because you said that your mother was a part of that residential school system, and you as well was part of that system. Would you like to go into telling us a little bit about what your experiences were?
Well, for myself personally, by the time that I attended, there was a shift going on in the school. So a lot of the trauma that I experienced wasn't as deep as what my mother had gone through or my older siblings. In the early stages of the residential schools, there were no type of regulations in place to really protect the children. And whenever there were reporting done to the police regarding any type of sexual abuses, the standard practice would be to relocate the person that was involved in abusing the children, whether it was physically or sexually. For myself, it was, I think, more psychological with the indoctrination of the Catholic religion being imposed on me and my family. And when you're a child and you don't understand the teachings of that particular faith in the way that is presented, it was very scary for me as a child. So it affected me. For example, I was 5 years old when I was taken, and when I would go outside to play, in the residential schools, we had these old-style merry-go-rounds, and they would bang against the pole. And as a child, I used to think that was the devil riding on that merry. So I was always in a state of fear, not realizing that was only nature that was causing that merry-go-round to bang against a pole. There was an incident where I experienced playing with my other cousins at the school. We were playing hide and go seek, and I seen a cat in a nun's garage, and I thought that was the devil because the cat's eyes are lit up at night. And so that really terrified me, and I went to tell my dorm supervisor that I had seen the devil, and of course she thought I was lying, and she said, "Well, I'm going to teach you a lesson to try and lie like that." And she grabbed me and took me and dunked my head into a toilet bowl. So for me it was more the physical kind of violence, the rigidity in which that school operated that created a whole sense of insecurity and fear, and I think the whole idea of being taken, for me personally, from my family.
So I was just thinking about that when you talk about your experience of seeing the cat's eyes, because in a normal situation, what would happen is that you would have the comfort of your mother. You'd be able to talk to your mother about what you saw, and it would be explained to you in a way that helped to alleviate that fear. But here you are as a young child, seeing something that scared you and going to the authorities in the residential school to talk about it, and you were further traumatized by, you said, having your head dunked in was it in a toilet that you said?
Yes.
Wow,
yes.
That is so horrific. It's hard for me to even put it into words because it sounds so strange.
It was also, the separation of siblings, because we weren't allowed to communicate with each other within the school. So not only were you was I take him from my family, my community, but even if I seen my brothers and sisters, we weren't allowed to communicate with each other. So, you were always in a state of loneliness. So not only was I not getting the proper care in terms of diet or nurturing, it was compounded by that deep sense of loss as a child and not having, any opportunity to be close to your relatives if you've seen them at the same school.
Yes.
The food part was really horrible because it wasn't nutritious, and it created a sense of competition amongst the children because the folks who operated the schools got better food, and so it created this competition with us as children because we would devise ways so that if we got to serve the nuns and the priests and the folks who operated the school, because they always got the better food, then we would make deals with each other and say, okay, well, we're going to steal that food so that after we serve them, we'll take whatever is left over and we would share it with the other kids back in our dorm. So there was always this sort of sense of bullying and rigid competition because you never knew how you were going to be humiliated as a child because you weren't allowed to share in any of your cultural traditions at the school. Everything was imposed.
Right. So as you think back to that kind of a situation where here you are, you're separated from your parents, you're in a strange place, but to compound the situation even worse, your siblings are there, but you're separated. You can't talk with your siblings, so you're further being psychologically abused by that. As you think back to that situation and what you went through as a child in that situation, is there a day that you would say this day stands out in my memory as the worst day, the day when things for me hit rock bottom?
You mean while I attended?
Yes,
school?
while you were there as a child.
I think the worst part for me was not being able to attend my grandmother's funeral.
I can hear like you're choking up there as you talk about that. You were not able to attend your grandmother's funeral. What are you feeling right now as you talk about that, Viola?
That loss.
That loss that is imposed on you as an individual, where your rights were taken away and you were separated from your family to the point where you couldn't grieve the loss of your grandmother. That must have been so hard for you to experience.
And I think it was I guess just the fact that the whole intent of the schools was to separate family and turn you into a white person.
I think there is this misunderstanding within our culture that the people who have had those kind of horrific experiences, that it's time for them to move on, that these things happened in the past, and people look at some of the unhealthy choices that are being made by people within the native communities and the high rate of suicides in those communities, the drinking of alcohol, the addictions and so forth, and seem to think that these people are just not ambitious, or they should just get over things and move on. But I guess when you talk about the kind of trauma that you experience, I think it makes sense that there is going to be long-lasting effects. Can you talk about what are your understanding of some of the effects from these residential schools that are now being lived out in this present generation? In other words, how it affects people today?
Well, I think there is a direct connection to the high abduction of children to this day into child welfare institutions, and in fact, one of the statistics that has recently come out point to the fact that there are more children in the child welfare system today than there was at the peak of residential schools. So when you're looking at an estimated 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, Métis children from across the country being abducted from their families and being forcibly abducted because they didn't have a choice. Parents and grandparents didn't have a choice because it was legislated. It was the law of this country. And it also has a direct linkage to the continued high push-out rates of children succeeding in the current education systems across the country. Because if you grew up with no proper education standards you didn't have the same resources as the mainstream public schools. Many of the residential schools were poorly funded. And so there's a direct linkage there. And then it's combined with the over-incarceration rate of both women and men and young Indigenous peoples right across the country because, parents and grandparents never had the opportunity to have the kind of nurturing that most Canadians would access within families.
So that's such an important point, Viola. I'd like to just talk about that a little bit. The nurturing that people miss when they're in these kind of environment, in these residential schools. There is this, your children are institutionalized. They don't have the impact of a loving mother. They don't have the sense of community of being with grandparents and siblings. So there is this isolation that is there. But I think from a psychological perspective, they're also missing the patterning, the examples of how to be a good mother, how to be a good father. And do you see how this is having effect in generations today?
It's compounded because, first of all, can you imagine growing up in a community where you don't hear the laughter of children? So it had an impact on the grandparents and the parents with having no children in their communities. Then it gets compounded by what do the children actually learn in these institutions, and they're influenced by the way that they're treated, because there's no nurturing, there's no respect. You're constantly being alluded to as if you don't have any self dignity. So when you come out of these institutions as an adult after being imprisoned, you come out damaged because it has that. It also invokes challenges, around the addiction rates, around the high rates of despair and depression. And then it also gets compounded when you've had children also abusing children, because that's what they've learned in the institutions. And
that's such an important point, right? So there's a vicious cycle of abuse that goes on. They see children are abused by adults, then they repeat the same thing. They don't have healthy patterning, so they continue that same kind of unhealthy behavior that they see from those who are in charge of them. And then if you fast forward into when these children become parents, then you can just understand the negative effects that these kind of experiences will have on how they in turn parent their children.
That's right. But I think the other thing that what's important for folks to appreciate is that these residential schools were started at the same time as the formation of Canada, which was in 1867. By the 1820s, you had the Roman Catholic, Protestant establish schools in the prairies as well as in northern regions of the country in British Columbia. And by 1883, we already have close to 80 residential schools established. And the last one didn't close until 1996. So that's 7 generations of families and communities that have been deeply wounded by this trauma intergenerationally.
You have expressed that so eloquently, and thank you for giving us those details, because sometimes we tend to think it's just a surface issue that was recently started and that it was just a few people that went through it. But you're painting a picture here of a very systemic abuse that goes back to the very origin of our nation. So at the beginning of the show, we mentioned the fact that you're with the Truth and Reconciliation. You're with Reconciliation Canada. What steps are being taken to halt the intergenerational curse that has been existing as a result of the trauma that has been suffered by these generations so far?
Well, one of the things that Reconciliation Canada is fostering reconciliation dialogue circles, and the idea of having reconciliation dialogue circles is to recognize that all Canadians require reconciliation, not just Indigenous peoples, because we recognize as a not-for-profit national charitable organization that there have been many atrocities, not just with Indigenous peoples, but with Asian people, South Asian people, Japanese people. And if reconciliation is to have a meaningful movement in this country, you can't really legislate reconciliation, because in order to cultivate reconciliation, we need to nurture empathy and a deep understanding of the truth of what's happened with Canadian people as well as Indigenous peoples. And so the idea is to have those opportunities, to have those conversations, so that what comes out of those conversations is a commitment for reconciliation action plans. And so we're quite excited and we're quite hopeful. British Columbia has committed to doing 100 dialogue circles with all their municipalities in British Columbia. We recently had 100 non-Indigenous employees from the city of Ottawa participate in information sharing, with the hope that in the fall they'll commit to a dialogue circle. So I think part of that is providing that opportunity to have conversations with each other, to share our humanity.
And I think that's such an important first step, Viola, because if people don't know the extent of the wound, the psychological wound that have been suffered, and how pervasive this wound is, then they can't make the adequate step to begin to treat it or to put solutions in place. So I think it's such a very important step to begin to have that dialogue. Where do we go from there, though? Like after this dialogue, after making these situations known to Canadians, what's the next step?
Well, I think it's a shared responsibility in terms of reaching that shared history of truth-telling with each other. In moving forward, it's providing opportunities to provide a safe space for those dialogues to happen between Canadians, because I think part of the challenge is that most Canadians don't know their shared truth. And so I think that's a critical part of that process.
Absolutely.
And when we can reach that common sense of understanding from our shared humanity, that's when reconciliation will meaningfully happen.
Right, so we're talking about at a societal level, having that knowledge and having steps toward announcing the truth or making the truth known. But you talked earlier about children leaving these schools damaged. You talked about the rate of depression, that a lot of these kids were depressed. You talked about also the pattern of abuse that is continued by children who live this abuse in these residential schools. Is there any kind of step that has been taken to bring mental health healing to these people who have suffered tremendously at the hands of this system?
I think that there is a greater recognition in terms of how support survivors, whether it's in relation to mental health, that rebuilding Indigenous ways of knowing and cultural practices has had a great influence in helping to recover from this trauma. And recently the premiers all met on the East Coast, and they've all committed to following through on the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action. And there are a large number of those recommendations incorporating, supporting Indigenous ways of healing practices that address those challenges through our cultural diversities, through our ceremonies, and through our cultural revival in terms of rebuilding language and rebuilding those sense of dignity for our people.
So I'm so happy to hear that not only is there the awareness, but there's actually plans in place to within your culture, within the culture of the natives, to begin to bring healing. Viola, we are almost out of time today, and I just want to thank you so much for joining us on this edition of the Life Transformation Radio Show, and for sharing your story, and for bringing this awareness to what have been suffered by people in this country, because sometimes we see this kind of ugliness as being something that is foreign, that happens abroad in different places. But I think you have shed some light here of the evil that has happened within our country as well. So thank you very much, and I just pray that God would bless you in the work that you're doing, and that you would continue to work to bring healing to your community in all that you're doing to help.
Well, thank you so much for having me on your show. I think the word transformation is a good word, and this is what we hope is that between Indigenous peoples and all Canadians, that meaningful transformation will happen in a good way for everyone.
Thank you very much, Viola. God bless you. So thank you very much for listening to this edition of the Life Transformation Radio Show. This is your host, Michael Hart of Elam Counselling Services. And today we have discussed a very important issue, the issue of intergenerational trauma. And you have heard Viola Thomas' story of what she has suffered in the residential schools. You have heard also what her people suffered in these residential schools. So next week we are going to continue to talk about intergenerational trauma, and looking at what the Bible says about intergenerational trauma, and we'll talk about some of the cure that can happen around intergenerational trauma. In my practice, I see Canadians who are suffering, who grew up in families outside of these residential schools that are suffering from intergenerational trauma as well. So it's something that goes across a wide spectrum of this society. So we'll be talking about this next week, and I want to thank you very much for listening to this edition of the Life Transformation Radio Show, and God bless you. And until next time, I pray that God would bless you in all your relationships and keep you sound in mind and pure in heart.